and welcome to Frontline Conversations. I'm Abhinav Chakraborty, and today I have Mr. Joel Simon with me in the studio. Mr. Simon is the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism at the City University of New York. I welcome you again, Mr. Simon.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'll start with my first question. There have been reports in the recent past of the Indian government considering the possibility of bringing in a bill to regulate digital media. This comes even as India has slipped to its lowest rank of 161 in RSF's Press Freedom Index this year. And the government has already attempted to restrict media freedom through legislation such as the IT Amendment Rules 2023, which facilitates the setting up of a fact-checking unit that can issue de facto takedown orders for information pertaining to the Union government, or even say the proposed Digital India Bill, which will replace the IT Act 2000. And this contains provisions pertaining to discretionary moderation of fake news, as it called it. You have written extensively about the weaponization of law by both governments and private actors against journalists. So how do you view this turn of events in India?
That is being employed by all sorts of political actors with different motivations to critique and criticize the media. Some, this notion of fake news, for example, that has been weaponized by governments around the world. There are new fake news laws that have been used to criminalize critical expression and have actually led to the imprisonment of journalists in many places. Now we see the concept of disinformation being weaponized, new laws being proposed. Let's stipulate that all of these efforts, to a certain extent, are in response to legitimate concerns about disinformation, about malicious actors seeking to seed their narratives within the information space. But governments are not reliable institutions to address these challenges. Usually they're motivated by asserting their own interests and using the power of the state to marginalize or isolate critical voices, including within the media. So I view, the notion that, the platforms, need to be regulated in some way. That's a legitimate point of discussion, but I have to view that this particular effort in that context, and so I view it with a certain amount of suspicion.
We have had the Union Minister of Information and Broadcasting, Anurag Thakur, say things in the past like newspapers should bring the right news before the public at the right time, and that along with shortcomings of the government, they should also highlight the public welfare schemes and policies of the government. Given that the press or the news media is a pillar of democracy, or as we know it as the fourth estate, what do you think should be the government's role, ideally in a democracy, as far as news media is concerned?
Well, in this particular instance, let's first recognize that governments and people within the government have expressive rights, and that public criticism of the media as an institution is legitimate, and it's really up to the media itself to respond to that kind of give and take, and it's normal and healthy within a democracy. So the criticism itself is not the issue. The issue in many instances is how that criticism could be weaponized, again, in the kind of information space. Many times government criticism is a triggering mechanism for trolls and online attacks and other kinds of interventions which amplify that criticism. And again, the criticism may be legitimate, but when it's amplified and weaponized online, it can turn into a form of harassment, which is intended to actually suppress some of that criticism. So again, it's all contextual. Governments have the right to engage in criticism and engage in a give and take with the media. That is normal and healthy, but within a democracy there also has to be institutional protections and a culture of political tolerance for that kind of criticism.
Right. We've witnessed a rise in the takeover of Indian news media by conglomerates and corporate groups. A recent example of this is NDTV, which was one of the few independent voices in a polarized TV news space, and it was taken over by the Adani Group last year. Such moves, as we've witnessed in the recent past, have often led to the ruling government's narratives, coming to dominate the discourse. Do you see this trend across the world, see, including the US? And if so, can corporate interests be subservient to the larger public interest?
Well, I think you've hit on the exact right framework. It's the one I continuously emphasize, which is public interest. You need media institutions and journalists to serve the public interest. And what is the public interest? It is ensuring that people have the information they need to participate as citizens in a democracy. So that is the public interest, and that is the role of the media to serve that function. So yes, I mean, there are certain advantages to having strong institutions that can resist government intervention in the information space, that can hire legal teams, that can have editors, that can have strong editorial culture, that can train journalists and bring them into media structures. We want strong institutions in many ways, but strong institutions can also be corrupted, and that is always a risk. So you need I think you need kind of a culture within media structures that puts public interest first. You need a market for that kind of journalism, which is increasingly being concentrated, and you need a political culture within these media organizations that resist that kind of pressure. And I can point to so many examples, including in the United States, where those kinds of structures are breaking down, and you see a media that is really not focused on its primary mission and is compromised politically in some form.
In the recent past, you wrote a piece for Neiman Reports earlier this year. You've written about a rights-based approach. What is a rights-based approach, if I have to expand on that? You talk about a focus on protecting rights of media outlets that report on corruption, advance accountability, and provide the public with perspectives on various issues. And you talk about this rights-based approach in advocating press freedom. In the same piece, you also acknowledged that, in the current environment, public interest journalism might not, or will not necessarily prevail in the marketplace of ideas. Given that we live in times of immense polarization, can different segments of the media across the spectrum stand united on something as crucial as this? And what are the changes that media freedom advocates can attempt to bring about?
Yeah, well, this is the nut. This is sort of what I've been thinking about. So, the rights-based approach to the defense of press freedom is really about defending the rights of individual journalists to express themselves when those rights are restricted. And the kind of animating argument behind that is that if the rights of individual journalists are protected across the spectrum, regardless of their ideology and their ethical practices, that's free expression, we defend everybody, then citizens will have access to the full range of ideas and information, and then it's on the citizens to sort through this information and make informed decisions about the information they need to participate in a democracy. That's the rights-based argument. Now, the challenge with that in the current context is, we still obviously need to defend everybody's rights, but the problem we're facing in the information space is it's become a very competitive environment where all sorts of malicious actors are actually competing for attention, right? So it's not only about suppression of speech, it's about flooding speech with counter narratives, often promulgated by governments or political actors or others with a particular interest. And so the antidote to that, you could sort of call it, we could fight disinformation, but there's another way of thinking about it, which is how do we elevate journalism that serves democracy and that serves the needs of citizens? To me, that is public interest journalism. And public interest journalism is journalism that allows people to make informed decisions. And I think that as a matter of public policy, so not just as a matter of rights, we need to make sure that this kind of information is elevated within this information space and ensure that citizens have access to this information. So that's my new paradigm, my new way of thinking about some of these issues, which has been, my work for the last quarter century.
Right. Staying on the subject of polarization, this idea that journalists should be neutral, or they should aspire to neutrality, is bandied about quite a lot. Does the term have a place in a journalist's vocabulary?
I mean, everyone's got their own term. I'm definitely never like neutral. There's some people like objective, some people like independent, but I think the point is journalism is a diverse space. There's all kinds of different journalism, and there always has been. There's a certain kind of journalism that certain media institutions practice, which is sometimes called objective. It's one form of journalism. I think it has a place. I understand objective not as both sidesisms, one side is saying nonsense and one side is saying something that, is obviously accurate, then you don't have to report both sides. To me, independence or objectivity, whatever you want to call it, is that journalists don't make up their mind until they've done the reporting. You go in there with an open mind, you listen to all sides, but then once you've done the reporting, you still have to treat everyone fairly, but it's fine to make informed determinations that this is the more accurate perspective and to emphasize that. That is a form of journalism that has immense value because it can create a kind of consensus around facts and it can, again, serve a broad audience. But there's also plenty of room for journalism that might have a more activist or advocacy bent, and publications that see the world through a more ideological perspective or have a particular area of concern and emphasize that or a certain perspective in their reporting. I really think we have room for both. So I think this is a bit of a false dichotomy and something that we as a profession really need to get beyond and stop arguing about.
Some media commentators believe that the Indian news media, and particularly television news, is slowly beginning to resemble Radio Rwanda, considering the amount of hatred and divisive debate on most primetime news shows. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you think it's an overstatement?
Well, I can't possibly make a judgment about that because I'm not, watching and engaging with the Indian media, and it's obviously in multiple languages, and so I wouldn't deign to make a judgment. But I'll say a couple things. I mean, look, that's an extreme analogy. Radio Rwanda was a form of incitement to. It was used as an instrument of incitement to genocide, and it was a coordinated government campaign that had the explicit purpose of inciting the population to take armed action against another segment of the population, and it's completely prohibited. It's a violation of every international legal standard. So that's a really extreme analogy. I can't make a judgment about the quality of the broadcast media, but I would just note that any media that's engaging in that kind of speech, there's no legal protection for incitement to violence, or especially incitement to genocide.
Right. In your recent book, The Infodemic, which you've co-authored with Robert Mahoney, you've written about how governments hijacked the flow of information and usurped power using different means. Among many countries such as China, an excerpt of which was run in the New Yorker, then you've mentioned countries like Iran and Russia and Brazil and even the United States and Donald Trump. You also mentioned India as one of the countries where that happened. Would you like to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing, the pandemic was born in censorship. You'll recall, when it first emerged in Wuhan, and the response of the Chinese government was to censor and suppress early indications that there was a new infectious disease circulating. They censored the medical community. They censored journalists who sought to report on it. Who knows how the pandemic or how the disease might have played out differently had there been a more open information environment. We'll never know. But certainly censoring information about a threat to public health has repercussions, and we saw that. And what happened with the disease is, as it spread around the world, so did censorship. And I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists at the time, and the wave of censorship around the world the fact that it was happening in nearly every country simultaneously was something unprecedented. And different governments had different motivations for censoring and managing speech. And as the disease spread to more democratic countries, particularly those led by populist Democrats, leaders were confronted with a dilemma. The dilemma was, do we follow public health guidance and take measures that might reduce the spread of the disease, but also might have economic and political consequences? And many governments particularly populist governments, were loath to do this. So in the United States, we saw Donald Trump systematically undermining public health advice and undermining attempts to build a public health consensus, and also abrogating responsibilities and putting them all in the states. We saw a similar dynamic play out in Brazil. In India, it was a bit different because the Modi response, the response of the Modi government in India was initially to recognize certainly the public health risk of this disease and to take very dramatic steps to kind of shut down the country. The thing that Modi did, though, that was quite alarming, was suppressed much reported about the terrible, terrible hardships that this created for so many citizens of India who had to return suddenly to their villages, and their lives were disrupted, and there were journalists who sought to report this and countered the narrative that the government was trying to assert, and so they faced consequences. And then in the second wave of the disease, I think the Modi government felt that it had established a powerful narrative that was that through these measures, India had contained the disease. Okay. But then it started to reemerge, and I think there, because of the narrative that the government had created in its own mind, it was slow to take action. And so by the time it began to take root and the media and experts began to talk about this, the government was resistant to this narrative. And so, I think that, it sort of was a situation in which the government began to believe its own propaganda and to suppress information and undermine information that contradicted it. And this was certainly not unique to India. This was a framework that we saw play out in so many different countries around the world.
Sure. I think I'll go to the question about fake news. When Donald Trump attacked New York Times, one of many outlets, on multiple occasions by decrying their legitimate news coverage as fake news, it resulted in a significant rise in subscriptions for them. But one can attribute that to the institutional strength of the media in the United States, which is of course rooted in constitutional safeguards such as the First Amendment. On the contrary, we've had not just digital outlets, but even media bigwigs, such as the Hindi daily Dainik Bhaskar, which did some impressive coverage during the COVID second wave, and BBC, which broadcast the documentary The Modi Question, which has been at the receiving end of raids and surveys by government agencies following unfavorable coverage of the current dispensation. And all of this has become so normalized that when a newspaper, decides to temper its critical coverage following such government action, it is considered par for the course. In fact, it's even cheered upon by some quarters. Do you think that media watch as a subject, which is still nascent in the Indian context, could bring these issues to the forefront? And should more news outlets be doing something like a media watch?
Well, that's a very specific question about a very diverse and complex media, multiple different languages that I can't possibly, really grasp in the limited amount of time that I've spent in India, even though I've had diverse, wonderful opportunities to talk to, a range of journalists and media institutions. But I do think that, speaking more generally, the media, like every institution, needs to be accountable, and the way in which journalists hold strong institutions accountable is through their reporting. They don't have any other mechanism to do so, by bringing it to light, by applying scrutiny. And, I think there are areas where journalists need to cooperate and work together and defend certain essential interests, for example, around press freedom and around fundamental rights. And there are areas where they need to compete, where it's healthy for them to compete. It's healthy for them to compete, in the market. I think that often results in, or not always, but can result in, giving and, the reader has more options and more diverse perspectives, and it can have a positive impact. And another area where it's healthy for them to kind of engage in a more competitive practice is uncovering other media institutions. So there's a certain reticence to do that, and it's understandable. But in general, I think it's a good practice, and it's healthy for media organizations to have a media reporter, or for specialized media publications to scrutinize media performance and to report on it. I think that's good for democracy.
When one considers the fact that the United States likes to think itself as the leader of the free world and aspires to be a leading light when it comes to media freedoms or press freedoms, you also see something like the government persecuting someone such as Julian Assange, or imprisoning Chelsea Manning for a number of years. So these are the instances where the stakes of media freedom are really high. So how do you reconcile these two things?
Well, I think the notion, even within the government, certainly within the media sector in the United States, that there's something exceptional about, that we're somehow insulated or isolated from these global trends. I think we're actually at the center of them. I mean, all the issues we're talking about in India, president in the United States, we've had a president who, I mean, in a way, there was even more, in terms of the language used, was like, could not have been more direct, could not have been more antagonistic. And yes, it's great that media institutions were strong enough to resist that pressure, but it's not good for democracy. It's not good for the institutions and and building the kind of political consensus that's necessary for the formulation of legislation or public policy. So there are a lot of very significant challenges in the U.S. In the information space. I mean, regarding Julian Assange. I mean, Julian Assange is a polarizing individual, and there are lots of people who really, some people, think that what he did, in basically, taking information and putting it into the public realm was wonderful, and other people think that it was, destructive, and there are various opinions about him. I mean, I don't think what he did was fundamentally journalistic, but I do think that prosecuting him under the Espionage Act is terrible for press freedom. And the reason is that the legal argument that the U.S. is asserting in prosecuting Julian Assange and seeking to extradite him is that the publication of classified information is a form of espionage, right? But this is what journalists do. I mean, they publish classified information when it's in the public interest, right? I mean, this is the difference between what Julian Assange did and what journalists do. I mean, I think journalists don't just say, hey, this is classified, I'm going to publish it, which is essentially what he did. They're like, this may be classified, but I looked at it, and I think the public needs to know this, so I'm going to publish it. There's a difference. But I don't think that you can make a distinction legally if you criminalize the publication of classified information. There's really no legal argument that protects the New York Times, or for that matter, any journalist anywhere in the world, because the U.S. is asserting this legal authority extraterritorially. It's saying you don't have to be a U.S. citizen, this doesn't have to be published in the United States. If you published classified information and made it public, anywhere in the world, you could be subject to prosecution. So I think this is not only legally dangerous, it really sets a very poor standard, and underlines, U.S. credibility, which we need. We need U.S. credibility on this issue in order to, defend the rights of journalists everywhere in the world when they're under threat, and also to have media policies in the United States that are, that elevate the kind of information that we need to have an informed democracy.
So the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism comes out with a digital news report every year, and this year's DNR highlighted an interesting and what I feel is a worrying trend, that 45% of the people surveyed in India, they tended to avoid news on negative subjects. Now, what are these negative subjects? You have the war in Ukraine, you have national politics, you have issues such as that of crime and security, you have social justice issues. We now have a prominent Hindi newspaper which proclaims itself as a no negative news. Like they say that we have no negative news on one particular day of the week. So, what is the major challenge for news media in this regard, and how do we make people care?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a journalist for 30 years, and my editors have been asking me, why should people care about this? It's a perennial refrain that every journalist hears from their editors, and to a certain extent, it's our job, to make people care. And as I said, we as journalists, it's there's a kind of emphasis because of the way the structure, the kind of information structure works on maximizing your audience, but it's always a balance between reaching as many people as possible and informing them as citizens. That's the public interest versus the kind of more commercial aspects of media, and you have to do both in a way. I mean, I think it's legitimate for journalists to say, well, look, if I'm writing articles that are really informative and nobody reads them, how am I contributing? Or if I'm writing articles that a lot of people are reading, but they don't, really elevate the public dialogue, then perhaps I'm not contributing either. So it's really finding that right balance. I mean, I don't, and it's also recognizing that readers and consumers of information are changing in their habits and their outlook, and to a certain extent, we as media institutions and journalists have to kind of figure out strategies that allow us to reach them where they are. So, using and embracing new communications tools when they become available. And, I don't have a problem with a specific media organization if it's a tool to get people to engage and care and say, we're going to emphasize positive news in certain contexts, as long as that's not their only role. I mean, I really think, the only way to evaluate whether the media is performing its function is to think about why do we have media freedom? Why do we have journalism? Why do we need journalism in a democracy? And it's because it's through journalism that people get access to this essential information, and whatever efforts we must undertake to achieve that goal, I think are absolutely worth considering.
Another trend which came across in the report was that of a platform shift. Just speaking of India specifically, 61% of the respondents preferred to consume news by either listening or watching it, as opposed to reading, which was 39%. And globally, the trend is that 57% prefer to read it. Do you feel that this kind of shift is permanent?
I don't know, and I also think that some of the ways in which people consume information is driven by platform policy, and platforms change. When platforms were emphasizing video, and Facebook and was emphasizing news, and now they pulled away from news, and then they pulled away from video. So there's a kind of chicken or egg question about whether the platforms and their policies are shifting behavior, or whether the platforms are responding to consumer demand. I don't really know the answer, but it's we're in an incredibly volatile moment, both in terms of the platforms and the way they deliver information, and because of the emergence of AI. A lot of those sort of paradigms that we've been thinking, dealing with, about how these systems work are going to change. And they're going to change dramatically, and we're going to face the kind of disruption, we faced, I think, at the beginning of the dawn of the internet. Right, it's going to be a disruption on that scale, and we have some ideas about what might happen and how AI might change journalism in the information space. But there's a huge, kind of dark spot that we just can't see. So I think the only thing we can be certain of is that change is coming, and we're due for another wave of digital disruption.
And come to my final question. As someone who's been at the forefront of press freedom advocacy for over 2.5 decades, in fact, almost 3 decades, what would be your recommendations to improve the state of media freedom in India?
Well, look, I mean, the one thing that I've been talking about during my visit here is the challenges are enormous, and I think it's understandable that people want, simple, straightforward answers, and I just don't have them. I think that there are a couple of things to keep in mind. I mean, I think I'm really, to a certain extent, I'm talking to journalists, and I think there's a kind of responsibility that journalists have taken on, which I think goes well beyond the profession, which is, journalists are not going to save democracy. Journalists can serve democracy, but they can't save it. There are so many incredibly powerful forces that are disrupting, kind of democratic institutions, including the media, that we as individual journalists, I do think there are things we can do, but I don't think we should be so grandiose as to think that we can solve this kind of problem. That's the kind of disruption of the information space and the impact that has on both democratic governments and accountability on a global scale. So I think that to a certain extent, journalists have lost their confidence in the essential work that we do and its value. And I think we really need to lean into that role, and we need to recognize, and work hard to meet that role. And that role is its most basic element, involves ensuring that the people who engage with the media that we produce, whether in whatever form it might take, that we see them as citizens, and that we seek to inform them and empower them and entertain them and do other things as well. But that is the heart of why the protections for free expression exist for journalists. It's because of this essential role. And if we don't fulfill it, then the protections that we enjoy will erode. And we're starting to see that happening. And the political space that we operate, the institutional and normative structures that allow us to do our job will erode. And we're seeing that happening. So I think that the most essential advice I can give to any journalist is not the big advice, like how do we set up democracy. It's really like, do your job, do it as well as you possibly can, never lose track of your audience and the purpose of what you do. I would give the same advice to media houses and media institutions. And, I think that is an essential contribution and not at all an insignificant one. And I think that's where we should put our emphasis.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Joel Simon.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.